Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. In this episode of All Things Policy, we're going to discuss the AI diffusion rules recently introduced by the US. And to do that, I have with me Ashwin Prasad, a research analyst from the high-tech geopolitics team. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific team. Welcome, Ashwin.
Hey, Vanshika.
So just to get things started, there's been a lot of buzz around the new AI diffusion framework and the export controls that the US has launched. And just to give some context to our listeners, so in January earlier, the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry Standards, BIS, published some rules that introduces new export controls on AI model weights and advanced computing ICs, integrated circuits, in the Export Administration Regulation. Correct? And these controls are intended to restrict exports to certain countries while establishing a framework to support the diffusion and supply of certain model weights and ICs to allied countries. In issuing this, the BIS explains that the controls are necessary and, to quote, cultivate secure ecosystems for the responsible diffusion and use of AI and ICs while protecting US national security and leadership in the sector. So to break that down, Ashwin today will break down all the rules that seem very, very complicated and full of technical details. So Ashwin, what are these new rules? What are we talking about here?
Honestly, Vanshika, the rules are such a maze that it's really hard to wrap your head around the whole thing in one go. I have been trying to decipher this for myself, and on the broad sense is that the US wants to ensure that the most powerful AI systems in the world are created in the US. So that is their main goal with the AI diffusion framework. And there are a bunch of things that drive this thinking or the motivation for this framework. One is that AI is a emergent general purpose technology that can potentially transform economy and the military power of a country in the coming years. Has it happened already? That's still a question that we can't definitively answer. But will it happen? The US thinks so. At least they are hedging for a scenario where that is true. And when that is true, they want to make sure that they get the maximum benefits out of that event. And the way they are going about this is that AI systems need computational power. And this computational power comes from integrated circuits, silicon chips, or also can be referred to as AI chips. And US has a firm dominance in this supply chain of designing and making these AI chips. They are fabricated in other countries, but US has the IP and the talent and the ecosystem that is mainly responsible for these AI chips. So US is trying to use this leverage and control how AI systems spread across the world. Broadly, this is what the rules are all about.
Right. So I understand there are also certain license exemptions that they've given. So could you explain that in some detail?
Yeah. So like I said, the idea is if there is extremely powerful transformative AI systems in the future, US wants to make sure that those AI systems are American, or at least American allied in their nature. So, but it also has to, while preparing for this scenario, it also has to make sure that the business today continues as usual, because unlike, let's say, a nuclear missile technology or space technology, which was at least the Cold War era space technology, these technology ecosystems were government dominated, right? It was the government agencies, government facilities, government personnel. It was extremely government controlled, and all of it was in a single country. So all of the nuclear missiles made in that America owned were made in America. But now AI is very different. AI is private driven, and the supply chains are huge. They are long. They are all over the world. No one country, not even the US, dominates the supply chain so much that they can do the whole thing on their own. And because of this, they have to depend on a set of partner countries and also private companies in their quest to keep this technology under their own control. And so the exemptions serve as a way to maintain the status quo in terms of the business these companies get, to safeguard the interests of the close allies, for instance, who are also part of the AI supply chain, and to make sure that, except on the scenarios of the most cutting edge AI systems, all the other things can happen as they have always happened over the before the framework. So that is why the exemptions exist. They are a way for the US to allow the present to continue. And if there is, let's say, a very powerful advanced AI system coming in 5 years later, that can happen only in the US. But everything else, all the other things, for instance, ChatGPT that we use, the Claude AI we use, the image generators that we use, are using AI for social welfare that many countries are practicing. All of those existing AI technologies, even the most powerful existing AI even technologies that exist today, can continue being accessible to the rest of the world. Because that exactly is the reason why US has this dominance in AI, right? So
Right. Since you brought up the private sector, Ashwin, and the role that they play, there is something that I read in the diffusion rules, which is called validated end user authorization, right? And they've introduced, this was actually much before this announcement, where they've introduced two types of validated VEUs, universal and national. Now, as I understand, under the current regulations, the designated UVUs, they have an opportunity to develop partnerships with government regulators. And this could essentially lead to regulatory capture, right? Where privileged entities continue to enjoy that influence over governmental decisions and leverage those relationships to modify rules to keep their market positions exclusive. So, could you explain this? What this validated end user authorization is? What's the difference between the universal and the national?
yeah, basically, this is a coexistence of the state and the private industry, and the rules are a way to balance the interests of both. And it is true that by essentially monopolizing AI in the US, within the US corporations, there is an advantage that these companies will enjoy, but they are also forced to play by a few rules that the US government has imposed, where they can't, let's say, sell to China. So I will, before we come into the VEUs, let me give a broad overview of the rules themselves. So firstly, the rules divide the world into three blocks, right? Three tiers. The first tier, let's call this tier one, are countries that are either firmly in the AI chip supply chain, such that you can't, if that country is not there, you can't really make and sustain AI chips and AI ecosystems. Or they are countries that are so closely allied with the US that US has a lot of trust and a lot of a history of security cooperation with these countries. So these are 18 countries. Broad examples are the UK, which is a very close partner, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. These are all historic allies. And then there is countries like Taiwan, which US needs to fabricate these cutting edge AI chips. US corporations might design them, The IP might be the US, the software platform is from the US, but ultimately the fabrication happens in Taiwan right now, most of the fabrication. So Taiwan is also a part of this tier one. And Japan, for instance, also has a history of memory chips that are extremely important in the AI supply chain. So these countries form tier one. And then you have tier two, which is, let me come to tier three first. So you have the tier two, which is the rest of the world. But let's first, tier three is countries that are arms embargoed by the US. So China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the usual suspects, the usual adversaries of the US. And these are the countries that have been denied the access to AI chips. And this was true before also. The rules are not changing anything significant here. These countries could not access chips even before because of the existing export controls that were in place by the US before the AI diffusion rules, and they continue to face the same restrictions. Tier 2, which is more interesting, where India is also in Tier 2, by the way, is the rest of the world. So you have Tier 1, which is the close allies. You have the Tier 3, which is the adversaries. And then there's Tier 2, which is the whole world, which includes India. And it's puzzling. It includes Israel and India, which are closely allied with the US. It also includes some other countries which are not so close to the US, but at the same time, they're not strictly arms embargoed as such. So the framework imposes the system where the countries in the Tier 1 enjoy near unlimited access to AI chips and AI technology in general. There is no restriction on these countries. Tier 3 countries continue being denied AI chips. That's the same, that there have been export controls from 2022 in the chip category. And there was one in 2024 as well. And this system just perpetuates that. There's no change there. In the countries in the Tier 2 is where it gets interesting, because you see there are American companies, there are some of these companies from the Tier 1 countries, and they need a place to do business, right? They need customers, they need a market. And a lot of the market will come from Tier 2, the rest of the world. But US also wants to make sure that the most powerful AI systems don't go to Tier 2 without being in the US first. Or, US wants to have that control. And so that is why the export controls have exemptions, have the validated end user authorizations, have standard export control licenses, and all of that. So basically, let's go over each of these briefly. Company that is developing a large data center to run AI models may establish, maybe this, let's say this is Microsoft. Microsoft can go and establish data centers in the US or the closely allied US countries with minimal restrictions. They have some security protocols to follow, but that's it. But the minute they want to establish it in, say, India, then they have to get what they call as a universal validated end user authorization. So the universal validated end user authorization exists only to American corporations or corporations that come from the Tier 1 countries. They are not available to, say, Reliance, which is from a Tier 2 country. And once they get a UVEU, a universal validated end user authorization, they are free to go and establish data centers and host large AI compute in those countries with very little red tape. There are restrictions, obviously, but these companies can go ahead and reap the commercial benefits out of establishing data centers and making money off of AI, basically. The only restriction is that suppose Microsoft has compute in a Tier 2 country, that out of the total compute it has, this cannot exceed, the compute it has in the Tier 2 country, in India, let's say, cannot exceed 7%. So there is a very small percentage of the compute that it can host in Tier 2 countries. In the US itself, it has to host 75% because it's an American company. But suppose there's a company from, let's say, UK that is wanting to do this, then the limits are lower. They have to host only half of their capacity in the US, and rest of it can be in other countries. So the basic idea is that most of the compute stays in the US for companies that are coming from America or the American allied countries. So then you also have a scenario where an Indian company might want to establish a data center. And these companies have to get a national validated end user authorization. This is where the NVEUs come. So NVEUs are issued per company per country. So while Microsoft can get one UVEU and go about establishing data centers all across the tier 2 countries, NVEU is issued by country. So if Reliance wants to establish a data center in, let's say, UAE, right, they have to get a different NVEU. The one they have for India won't work, right? And for these NVEUs, there are absolute caps. There is a fixed number of chips that they can host based on the year. For 2025, it is 100,000 NVIDIA H100 GPUs. H100s are, for the most part, one of the most advanced AI chips made by NVIDIA and widely used around the world. They can host 100,000 of these, which is not less at all. To put it into perspective, in Tennessee, in the US, there is a Colossus XAI facility, which is owned by Musk, and this is by all standards the most world-class public AI facility in the world. Right, it is the largest, as large as they come today, and that also has 100,000 H100 GPU. So effectively, the rules allow an Indian company to host the same size as Colossus XAI facility in India, which is very generous, right? You would think, what is the point of these rules then? So that's where that point about what I said comes in, that US wants to prepare for a scenario where if AI systems become much more powerful than they are today, then it wants it to be in America. Otherwise, if they continue being as they are, that can happen anywhere in the world. US is not bothered, because so that's the hedge that they are doing with the rules. Besides these, there are other exemptions. For instance, countries can apply for a one-time license exemption, and this will come with its own limits. There is also some smaller caps for, let's say, there is a company that is doing some medical research and they need AI chips, but they're not necessarily hosting. Like, they're not trying to develop an AI model of their own. It's just a small use case. Those get exempted as well. So there are ways to ensure that companies can go about their business as usual, except in the cases where they are developing extremely powerful, extremely advanced AI models, in which case they can't do it outside the US.
Right. Yes, as you pointed out, there were concerns, right, that restricting these advanced computing chips, which are not necessarily always used for AI, right? They have very broad applications, for example, performing large mathematical operations. They have applications across the board, like you mentioned, health, education, and in various other sectors. So there was a question that restricting the access to these chips for 150 countries is a major technological setback, not only for the US, but for the entire world, which would stifle progress not only in AI, but across broader dimensions. But as you said, and as I understand now, that the rules are more flexible if you're not trying to compete with the US in creating very large AI models. So since you mentioned the three tiers, and we see a clear reordering of the US's vision of the world order, right? Countries which it feels are allies and countries which, of course, are not. But then this middle tier, which India belongs to, of course. What do you think are the broader geopolitical implications it could have on US's alliances with most of the countries?
One thing I would like to point out at the outset is that while this does represent US's worldview of the adversaries and the countries and the allies, there is a certain bias of valuing countries purely based on their stake in the AI supply chain. So that's why you have this contradiction of, let's say, India, which has been a key security and strategic partner for the US, especially in the Indo-Pacific region in the recent years. And there is also a member of Quad. Also, there has been serious technology cooperation under ISET, but still India has found itself in tier 2 and not tier 1, purely because India has very little capability in terms of its own AI supply in as a part of the AI supply chain. And second, there has been fears that there were reports of Russia getting chips from an Indian pharma company a few months ago. So that might also have led to the US viewing India as this uh, place where AI chips can leak out and fall into adversarial hands. But taking this approach, they could have, there was no, that doesn't warrant a blanket view of India as a tier 2 nation, which just suggests that there's a strong disconnect between US's strategic vision and its vision in terms of AI. Right?
Right.
That's a gap that I see uh, in their operations when it comes to this diffusion rules. And on the matter of what are the other implications of this thing is, one is that, look, this is not, even I don't think even countries in tier 1 are going to be flattered that are in tier 1 for the most part, because what, yes, they enjoy a lot of access, then they're going to be continually aligned with the US when it comes to a lot of strategic decision making. But it also means that US is making these unilateral decisions about who gets what, and that is a vulnerability, right? This all of this happened with executive action, and there was no precedence, there was no discussion, or there was no consensus built, that nothing, it was just announced one day on the last week of the Biden Harris administration, and everyone was shocked. So there will be some efforts to, hedge against this monopoly and this AI dominance that the US is going to just wield around in its day-to-day affairs. So there might be cases that countries try to develop some capability on their own. They might invest in alternate technology that can somehow bypass the rules if the US becomes much more conservative in its approach. It'll happen across tier 3, of course. Tier 2 also. India definitely will take this as a cue to develop some independent capability. And even in tier 1, because these might not always represent the interests of the allies and the corporations that have been forced to follow these rules. This represents the interests of the state. So that might happen. And on the whole, they establish a rule-based order for accessing AI chips, which were mostly ad hoc until recent years. So this is actually going to make operations and the processes smoother and may potentially quicker. So that's not a bad thing, but it is also very unusual to see the US behave this way, right? To like, put such big guardrails. That this is an insecurity that is very weird to see in the US, which has, usually been open with its innovation, with its talent, with its technology access. This technology denial trend is a puzzling thing to see.
Right. I mean, they have been gatekeeping education and knowledge for a while in some sense. So I think, but you're right. It is an outlier in that sense of this sudden behavior. So since we are talking about India, just another question on that, and I'll come to China in a bit. What are the specific, say, challenges and opportunities that you see for Indian tech companies, at least in the short term? And you can answer the next question as well, is how do you think Indian education and research institutions can adapt to AI research and their development strategies?
Opportunities and challenges. Well, opportunities are going to stay the same, because though the rules seem that they are, limiting India in some way, they are not right now, because Indian capability when it comes to AI compute itself is not extremely noteworthy as of now. So even the India AI mission the government is planning to have will have around, the 10,000 chips that they want to buy. The largest we don't have the extremely large data centers with 60,000 and 80,000 chips right now. So the rules allow us to do what all that we have to do. It just changes the processes of acquiring these chips, or there is some bureaucratic red tape, there is some and there is definitely an element of expectation from the US that India has to align with US foreign policy decisions, maybe, or strategic the decisions. There is going to be that attachment. So if India wants access to AI chips, it has to play by US's rules. That implication is definitely there. That is a challenge. It's going to be a diplomatic exercise for India. And, if the AI ambitions of India grows a lot and this framework stays as it is, India will have to jump through a lot of hoops, negotiate a lot, and ensure that India has the chips that it needs. But this is also an opportunity for India because our AI ecosystem is still nascent. We have not, there's that one, two, it has to do two things. Two opportunities, I would say, is one that we now have a strong incentive to get a firm place inside the AI supply chain of the world, because that is the only way that you will not be denied technologies related to AI in the future. You have something that everybody else needs. They will continue to give what they have in order for them to get what you have, right? So that is something that India has to establish. India has an incentive, a stronger incentive to establish that now. And on the whole, India also has an incentive to develop broader capabilities in the AI supply chain to achieve a level of independence, assuming that AI technology is everything that they promised, assuming there is an artificial general intelligence emerging out of the technologies of today in a decade, and that is going to turn AI is already equivalent to, maybe, let's say, nuclear missiles today, the way their export controls are. But assume it becomes the most critical technology for military, for economy, for everything. In that case, it is good if India has some independent capabilities in terms of making its own AI to, to self-sustain in case there are these export controls and the AI supply chains become more concentrated, constricted, and more guarded.
Right. And so now coming back to, not actually coming back, so addressing the whale in the room, which I think is DeepSeek. How has the talk of DeepSeek change the conversation? Because there's, and you can correct me, there's so much conversation around how DeepSeek did that, what they did with a lot less computing power that the US companies always claimed was needed to build an AI model at a lower cost. And as you said, these rules provide India with a stronger incentive to develop its own AI, right? And we've seen China done that to a certain extent. But putting these embargoes on China, which is, as you said, is in the third tier, will this actually also push China to accelerate its own chip making ecosystem?
Yeah, because there is now it's the that concept of creative insecurity, right? It is that you are now forcing China to muster all its resources and be independent in its quest for AI technology. Well, coming to DeepSeek specifically, uh, it is a strong process innovation by China in trying to do what it wants to do by without within the limited constraints of the resources it has, because of the export controls and because of all the conditions that the US has imposed on Chinese technological companies and ecosystem on the whole. Uh, is it going to significantly change the AI technology landscape in the future? Maybe, but the dominant narrative right now is that to develop better and better AI models, you need larger and larger data sets, and the training is going to become more and more compute intensive, and therefore you would need more powerful AI chips, in larger numbers, more powerful, more optimized, everything. So that is the narrative that is driving the export controls, that drives all of these AI diffusion rules and everything. The DeepSeek is an example of doing this without necessarily all of these things being true. But can it really scale up and become the best? Can it produce the best level, the most cutting edge level of AI models in the future? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And maybe the theories that the companies in Silicon Valley have is true, that they do need large compute. If that is the case, the export controls are going to stay the same. If that is not the case, then maybe the US is going to tighten this further. It might continue to even, like, let's say, make the less powerful chips a part of the rules. That can happen. So the DeepSeek as a technology is a statement by China that it can be autonomous, and it was done by a hedge fund. It was a private effort, But now the Chinese government might take it more seriously. They might have initiatives that will drive this trend more. But will it compete with the most advanced models in the short term? I don't think so. And if it does change the landscape, then the rules will evolve accordingly.
Right. Thank you, Ashwin, for answering so many questions and also making us realize that there are a few questions that at this point remain unanswered. So, as we discussed, and as you said, we don't know yet whether these rules inadvertently weaken US's position in the global computing market and enhances national security, or it actually drives the development of parallel AI ecosystems internationally, which would potentially diminish the influence of US technology. So I hope the leaders enjoyed listening to this episode and understood these very complicated rules in a better way. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanshika.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.